Philosophy of rhetoric in ancient Greece, from Homer to Plato. ALEXANDRU, ŠTEFANESCU. Abstract. Greek rhetoric makes the most of its relation with myth, poetry, and philosophy. Of course, this is no surprise at all. For any emergent cultural space, mixing myth with reason, vision with ideation, ecstatic experience with the sobriety of rigorous thinking, must be confronted with its foundational strives, as well as with its idiosyncrasies. The Greek approach on rhetoric seems to favor both. It is a means to a cultural development paradigm, as well as a subject for dismissing the outward appearance that rhetoric may be suitable for a Greek way of life. Between Homer and Plato, what is at stake may amount to a sound philosophy of rhetoric that sifts through Greek energy, valor, wisdom, even prejudice. Does Greek rhetoric embody the road to a necessary social and intellectual transformation, or perhaps the vitiated instrument of the morally corrupt? Or maybe a little bit of both. Keywords: Homer, Plato, Greek rhetoric, philosophy of rhetoric, cultural development. Greek rhetoric is, almost by default, prone to mythological, artistic, philosophical, scientific, human-like, and morally inclined structures. Is it too much to talk about a rhetoric specialized in existence itself? Not at all. And to prove that the assertion is perfectly justified, it will suffice to consider what are its uses, and where does its excellence stem from. First of all, rhetoric is good at uttering and, when it must, even at written delivery. For it is clear that writing is some kind of an outsourcing, and the Greek soul seems to be, at least platonically speaking, above such an endeavor. Even so, writing is law, social order, and disposal. Secondly, rhetoric is good at storytelling, as well as singing and picturing fables, legends, and heroes in hexameters, for again, the Greek character is the crux of any and all stories, and the core of the city itself. We will soon see how and, more importantly, why. Finally, rhetoric is good at philosophizing, as the word itself builds up the safest ground for a sound dialectics. As far as science goes, I propose we deal first with its rhetorization, and only then move to the foremost rhetoric of the Greeks. Such a proposal shall uncover its meaning presently. Our beloved Greeks will be judged here in relation to the other half, that is, the Oriental way. Unlike Greece, the Oriental approach to science can be seen as an extension of an administrative setting. Universal resources were quantified and listed. The dynamics of the stars, comprised in endless numbering lists depicting the life of the cosmos, is a plain example of Babylonian scientific exploration. Its purpose was both comprehension and anticipation. The Babylonian astronomer had his gaze set upon the power, as well as the administration of the world, both fathomed by means of a rather complex process of telling and foretelling. Today's position of the stars would certainly be in concert with tomorrow's position, with any given conjunction or eclipse. Scientific record and anticipation by inductive reasoning were mechanisms for capturing power, the very power of the world itself. Names were attached to the very nature of things, capturing their soul, and that meant not only that they should be closely observed, but also noted, gathered, listed. For the link between names and events, nomen est omen, is more profound than it would seem at first glance. Names provide entailment and formation. To know one's name is to gain possession of its power, to be granted access to its secret life force, or at least to tame it. This proves meaningful when we take into account that the real approach to harvesting the power of names is largely dependent on the list itself and its quasi-arithmetical function, thus orality being a mere byproduct of proper listing abilities. The word action or the word event, dabber, puts all of its energy into the world by means of the writing process. Therefore, orality becomes some kind of an adjuvant to a secondary writing which thus helps form any initial orality, and not the other way around as the Greeks would choose to presume. In ancient Greece, things turn out to be quite different. Being as philosophical as it can be, science steers away from the list. And of course, the authenticity of Greek philosophy rests mainly on its anamnestic value, which also transfers to science. Therefore, there is a massive overlapping between scientific and philosophical Greek rhetoric, from the Ionian philosophers and Socrates, investigator of the sky and clouds, as Aristophanes would put it, to Plato and Aristotle, and their half-scientific, half-philosophical institutions. Science, philosophy, politics are ways of reclaiming the habitat of the individual. The Greek anamnestic approach does exactly that. It forces individuals to authentically retrieve themselves within the boundaries of actual existence. As far as philosophical science goes, the universal construction, bound by natural parts and elements, water and air, for Milesian philosophy, Heraclitus fire, Democritus atoms, movement, rest and the illusion of movement for Parmenides and Zeno, and so on, is an active part of a perennial quest for truth, essence, and spirit, a never-ending Greek story that rhythmically unfolds throughout the ages. The Greek political discourse has a similar pattern. The individual anamnestically seeks his social shape and size, bound by society and constitution, politia. Moreover, the social and cultural graven image of the world does determine any particular existential structuring, not only direct politics, but also rhetoric, human-like and character-related values and manifestations. History and society are the first catalysts of the rhetorical existence we seek. Thus, I shall depart from the magic of the archaic, with all its cultural ramifications, and then move toward the polis. What exactly is historically specific for an archaic Greece? First of all, its relation with the Mycenaean typology at the conclusion of the Bronze Age. The end of the Mycenaean civilization, around 12th century BC, probably brought by the invasion of Dorian tribes, is what in turn makes room for the Greek culture itself. And it is the features of this dying Mycenaean civilization, of about 6 centuries in total, that appear as founding elements for a first Greek rhetoric. What exactly are those features? Royalty, religion, palatial administration. In the ancient Achaean society, the entire ensemble of religious, political, military, administrative, and economical structures revolves around the king's palace. The king, as anax, exercises the supreme military, economic, and religious authority, and his connection to a rather powerful sacerdotal class is what guarantees a discretionary control over the entire society. Thus, being in profound connection to the above-stated, Mycenaean rhetoric is one of the written records. From the later Greek standpoint, it is obviously a counter-rhetoric and, since it largely depends on listing and administrative archives, it does not embody that first authentic rhetoric that we seek. Furthermore, between the downfall of the omnipresent anax and the destruction of his grandiose palaces, writing itself disappears. And this is no coincidence. For what tends to also disappear is the listing culture itself, and the trend of written management of the administrative apparatus, making room for a brand new world and, implicitly, for a brand new word. It is precisely this new word that qualifies as actual rhetoric, a rhetoric that, throughout the following ages, will unravel the Greek classical as well as pre-classical culture, closely following 2 major threads, story, mythos, and reason, logos. But what is this first Greek rhetoric? Its conditions stem from the revolution of departing from the palatial Mycenaean civilization. The new social order claims certain revisions, such as iron replacing bronze or the transformation of ceramic art, but also certain fundamental ruptures between the old mystics and the new social reality, between men and gods. Here, the post-Mycenaean world lays the foundations for the Homeric world. Of course, Homer himself will artistically revive the Bronze Age heroes, the larger-than-life characters, capturing religion and myth, but he delivers his fabulous stories in a newborn and much calmer Greek world. It would seem that Homer's stories do translate into the first authentic Greek rhetoric, and this is no surprise. Such a rhetoric will live on somewhere on the brink of the Greek polis and its philosophy, between archaic and classical ancient Greece. What kind of rhetoric is this? One juggling storytelling, life itself, style, and thus anticipating some of the general eloquence techniques, and this should suffice. For Quintilian, who is also an excellent historian of rhetoric, plainly states that Homer had been the first one, a model and an inspiration for every department of eloquence, inst orat, x. 1:46. His very style is what sifts the first rhetorical visage. He is sublime when dealing with things of greater importance and graveness, while being natural when faced with the petty ones. He is at once luxuriant and concise, sprightly and serious, remarkable at once for his fullness and his brevity, and supreme not merely for poetic, but for oratorical power as well, inst orat, x. 1:46. As far as the Iliad goes, Homer seems to be covering an extensive rhetorical area. He sets the exordium, brings forth the power of the conclusion, and persuades through concentration and vigor. But that is not all there is, and here rhetoric claims its rightful essential ownership. For Homer is bound by passion, while also transforming the ethos in a major interpretive key. The story is a piece of the soul, and the soul merits narration. Furthermore, the Iliad also seems to anticipate a distinction between discourse genres, setting the scene for judiciary as well as deliberative techniques. It is clear, then, that Homer persuades through action, emotion, and character. Are these the actual pendants of future Aristotelian persuasion elements? It is plausible, to say the least. Action is closely argumentative, for it is the intertwinement of epical evidence. Passion, from hatred to revenge, from love to glory, is a byproduct of action, but also an initial burst, as proved by the fact that the story opens with the anger of Peleus' son, an anger that functions as a catalyst for a choice. Such a choice will be factual, sentimental, and ethos-related. To what end? Namely, a physical, intellectual, and moral excellence, arete, a generous educational ideal, the exemplar value of subordinating life, as a supreme good, to ideals such as glory and honor. A spiritual lifelong counsel. This is at stake with Homeric rhetoric, which advises and teaches as any authentic rhetoric would. The systematically didactical Homeric wager is self-evident. After all, it is about separating goodness from evilness, an enterprise dear to any articulate rhetoric. German classicist Walter Otto writes in the very beginning of his book about the Greek gods, Homeric stories have a clear-cut, sound vision of the world, and this is vividly expressed in everything coming to pass, being said or thought. Plain and simple. Therefore, since they depict a worldview of their own, can we see these stories as rhetoric endeavors? An overwhelming religious dimension, always accompanying the Homeric way of life, the image of the gods themselves, a certain existential philosophy of the individual foreshadowing his destiny, all these are elements meant to persuade, to deliver stories as well as counsel. This world is what makes and remakes all there is, merit and flaw, men and gods. This world is the proper ground for beholding what lies between earth and sky, and for building up a Greek atmosphere. The Homeric world is, without a doubt, a world of rhetoric. Then, could any worldview be construed as rhetorical? Indeed, any worldview, expressed in words or images meant to depict it thoroughly and set apart what is good from what is evil, what is to praise from what is to blame, what is right, what is wrong, what is fair or hideous, true or false, and, generally speaking, how can one live a meaningful life? Myth and story, a world of gods and heroes, diligence, beauty, and poetical chant, these are archaic persuasion mechanisms. On the other hand, myth functions as a philosophical vehicle as well, as it cannot suffer any reduction to poetical enterprise alone. The ever-growing wisdom from the 7th century onward cannot simply sever itself from an archaic, mythical, literary substance of the Greek world. At least, not immediately. This newborn Sophia, an image that the 7 sages will draw over the reflections of the former Greek soul, is a fundamentally human exercise. First and foremost, it will replace Mycenaean royalty, divine privilege, and a rather tumultuous relationship between men and gods. The new itinerary takes us to men, from the almighty gods, to a more human-like nature. And forming a social order derived from humanness alone is the fundamental role of such wisdom. From Solon to Cleisthenes, and then to Pericles, the city takes an authentically human social and political shape. How does this polis look like? First of all, it is a society governed by words. Now the active word becomes a political instrument, a means to an end, subject to authority and social domination. There is also a natural continuity in relation to the magic-derived and ritualistic essence of the ancestral word. But gradually, this word tends to shift away from a ritualistic display, in order to embrace oratory and controversy, both indelible instruments in a newborn democratic society. Secondly, the fundamentally public organization of the social life might also function as a catalyst to a rhetorical end. And then, of course, last but not least, there is reciprocity and equality amongst individuals. Let us go back now to the mythical background and its relation to philosophy, which is necessary in order to set the stage for Plato's Rhetoric. At the same time, with a particular form of secularization brought forth by the polis itself, a gradual shift in the cultural consistency of the myth is also at stake. The key changes, and Pericles' century tends towards a desacralization of the myth. But what exactly are the technical origins and the functional effects of mythical stories? They too are connected to a broader understanding of the world, a much revered treasure of amazement. For philosophical perplexity originally stems from stories and from myths, from magical constructs. Therefore, what does the myth stand for? The answer is self-evident. It stands for knowledge. It functions in 2 directions, one explanatory, formative, genetic, and the other structural, universe, gods, man, which are interconnected, for cosmogony deals with cosmic genesis, theogony with the birth of the gods, and anthropogony with the mythical spark of human existence. On the other hand, the pedagogical, as well as the artistic functions of the myth are both undeniable. The myth teaches, it moralizes, and educates, and this is what philosophy will discover. Also, the myth relates to a playful state of mind. It stands closely to the very core of storytelling and acting, for the story itself is being reenacted, and not solely within Greek culture, as proved, for instance, by the annual reconstruction of the confrontation between Marduk and Tiamat is being recited, retold, like the cyclical reciting of the Enuma Elish, or the Homeric recitations, gradually transformed in largely social habitudes. Having established the general functions related to myth, I now turn to Plato, seeking an answer to what the Platonic myth stands for. The road to wisdom clears up this path as well. For mythical structures encounter a philosophical structure that brings forth an alternate genesis, and other normative systems. What exactly is going on? The gods are being cut off from the main circuit. Conversely, men start measuring and dividing the world for themselves, seeking reasonable explanation patterns. A philosophical inherent defense mechanism against a counter-rational myth is therefore understandable. And yet philosophy cannot simply abolish the myth. For philosophy's task towards the myth is always to refresh it, to create it anew, rather than simply trying to annul it. Plato makes no exception to this rule. This is not merely a fatality, a tacit acceptance of the inescapable, but a conscious reenactment of the mythical paradigm. This is how the myth becomes an instrument for transmitting philosophical and rational messages, while mythology itself is reduced to an ancilla philosophiae form. But where is the connection with rhetoric? First, it can be found inside poetical art. For the myth cannot possibly survive on its own, as it constitutes poetry's main technique and raw material. Therefore, I depart here from Plato's claim that the poetical universe amounts to phantasmata, which are irrational forms, utterly severed from real exigencies and expectancies. The art as imitation theory, also engulfing myth, is advocated within Plato's tripartite composition, from the idea, to empirical structures, and ultimately down to constructions imitating reality, which relegates art even further, demoting it as second-hand imitation. Art functions precisely by disseminating an illusion upheld as truth. In Socrates' own terms, the mimetic art is far removed from truth, and this, it seems, is the reason why it can produce everything, because it touches or lays hold of only a small part of the object and that a phantom. For all that, my friend, this, I take it, is what we ought to bear in mind in all such cases, when anyone reports to us of someone, that he has met a man who knows all the crafts and everything else that men severally know, and that there is nothing that he does not know more exactly than anybody else, our tacit rejoinder must be that he is a simple fellow, who apparently has met some magician or sleight-of-hand man and imitator and has been deceived by him into the belief that he is all wise, because of his own inability to put to the proof and distinguish knowledge, ignorance, and imitation. Then, have we not next to scrutinize tragedy and its leader Homer, since some people tell us that these poets know all the arts and all things human pertaining to virtue and vice, and all things divine? The poet as open world, knowledgeable in any and all professions, vocational moralist and capable of imitating anything is not unlike a sophist juggling philosophy and rhetoric. For the sophist engages in any demonstration, playing with reason and perhaps simulating it. What is true and what is false does not seem his main concern, nor is it Homer's concern to fathom the degree of reality attached to his mimesis. Both are inventors, forgers, magicians, as images and fairy tales are for the latter what words are for the former, and both, images and words, are free to shape this world in whatever form they choose to. One objection is therefore bound by the inadequacy behind universal imitation. The other is purely moral. Poetry may corrupt, may distort true and meaningful education. Homer himself seems to feed to the young unsuspecting minds a vivid picture of distorted images, to say nothing of the total lack of veridical facts, almost inviting an educational and moral disaster. The Homeric way of life, the Republic, 600b, is counter-social, in the sense that it fails to educate individuals and contribute to social reforms. Moreover, true education will be dependent on truth and virtue, surely as pursuing truth helps form true character. Then, the just man will not allow for any deception by means of illusions and false pretenses. The unwarranted, false virtue of the poets places the accent where it ought to be. Shall we, then, lay it down that all the poetic tribe, beginning with Homer, are imitators of images of excellence and of the other things that they create and do not lay hold on truth? But surely it does more than that, as this virtue-related denouncement makes room for introducing the sophists. First, let us take a look at Phaedrus and the hierarchy of merits found in the conclusion to the immortal soul tale. The social order of reincarnation places the poet and the sophist in close proximity, almost shoulder to shoulder. The first place goes to the philosopher, and then comes the king, who is bound by laws, then the statesman, the doctor, the healer, and the prophet, while the sixth and eighth places are respectively set for poets and sophists. They are only separated by the seventh position held by manual laborers, and eventually, the ninth and final position is reserved for tyrants. It is even clearer now that, as long as poetry and rhetorical sophistry are complementary, to say the least, and there is also an old quarrel between philosophy and poetry, the Republic, 607b, rhetoric will thus inherit the faults of her older sister. The psychological dimension of sophistry can provide further explanation. The sophist is good at being to the crowd's liking, projecting words which are woven in his declamations. This is a strategy not unlike the imitator who strives to please and make his work appear beautiful to the ignorant multitude. The Republic, 602b. Indeed, the illusory rhetorical fabric, its social and moral mimesis, and the overall capacity of rhetoric to draw circles on the water mirror, without actually engaging in seeking the truth that lies beyond, in the bottomless pit of the sea, all these clearly stem from the Socratic message when dealing with sophists or sophistry-inclined interlocutors. What is rhetoric? Also in comparison to philosophy, this is a legitimate question, and the topic spun between Socrates and Gorgias. The answers do not seem to favor the latter. For rhetorical art is concerned with speech, 450 c. But what is actually advocated within such speeches? Individual freedom and social wits, 452d, made possible through the art of moving and swaying either judges in the law courts or statesmen in the council chamber or the commons in the assembly or an audience at any other meeting that may be held on public affairs, 452e. This power resembles that of the magician who enchants and enslaves with but a touch of his wand. It is, thus, a psychological power which makes rhetoric become a belief maker, pithis demiurgos, a spiritual activity cast upon the receiver. But courts and assemblies do receive from speakers an image of what is right and what is wrong. This is Gorgias' claim. And yet, such beliefs will not be reasonable, since they are bound by faith, and not by reason, for 54e 455a. Rhetoric will praise and condemn, revere and destroy, whereas philosophy amounts to a sound dialectical effort. Philosophy is biunivocal and dialogical, while rhetoric seems dogmatic, confined to a speaker's utterance before the more or less ignorant masses. Wisdom itself is at stake here, true happiness and social worthiness, and not merely the reward for winning arguments. To all these, Socrates adds his own attempts to define rhetoric, as flattery, for 63a, as semblance of a branch of politics, for 63d, instinctively usurping and seducing, permanently seeking pleasure and sensorial flattery. Looking for an analogy, Socrates will assert that rhetoric does for the spirit exactly the same that cookery instead of medicine does for the body. Therefore, it is all about image, eidolon, illusion, and appearance, a social and moral doppelganger. The problem of deceit, flattery, image, and confusion within the doxastic universe of apparently wise men, doxosophoi, all these contribute to the particular intertwinement of three Platonic threads: poetry, rhetoric, sophistry. What is the nature of these disciplines? This is only the first problem that has to be addressed. And which part of the individual do they connect to? This is the second one. The answer is self-generated, they target the soul. Socrates himself warns the unsuspecting Hippocrates about cavalierly giving one's soul away. Tell me, are you aware upon what sort of hazard you are going to stake your soul? If you had to entrust your body to someone, taking the risk of its being made better or worse, you would first consider most carefully whether you ought to entrust it or not. But in the case of your soul, which you value much more highly than your body, and on which depends the good or ill condition of all your affairs, according as it is made better or worse, would you omit to consult first with either your father or your brother or one of us your comrades, as to whether or not you should entrust your very soul to this newly arrived foreigner, whom you call sophist, in patent ignorance of what this sophist may be to whom you are about to entrust yourself? Can it be that the sophist is really a sort of merchant or dealer in provisions on which a soul is nourished? And we must take care, my good friend, that the sophist, in commending his wares, does not deceive us, as both merchant and dealer do in the case of our bodily food. For I tell you there is far more serious risk in the purchase of doctrines than in that of eatables. It is then perfectly reasonable to cast the soul as the main character on a philosophical way of life stage. It is precisely this difference between philosophy and sophistry Reinhardt shows us to advance, in his book on Plato's myths, the soul, and its weight on the existential scale. Or, in different words, the spiritual, soul-like core found in language, dialectics, myth, law, even love. Knowledge itself penetrates the soul, healing or sickening it. The soul, that initial old soul, lacking artificial intervention, now rediscovered by Plato, is everywhere you look, state and cosmos, clergy and prophets, rational and mythical worlds. It is, then, only natural that the circle be closed by returning to the myth, and, generally speaking, to all spiritual tales that preach and teach.